afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Aye, great. Devolution, all the rage, isn't it? All the rage. And I think, for me, CLES is 30 years old next year. Centre for Local Economic Strategy is 30 years old next year. Based in Manchester, but UK-wide. Our founding mothers and fathers put us there because they said, let's not put another bloody think tank in London. The original, I suppose, of devolution, at least in terms of think tankery. And for the 30 years we've been talking about an economy that's virtuous, an economy that advances social justice, not just an economy for the economy's sake, but an economy that actually improves the lives of people and their places. There's many positives to devolution, yeah? Bringing decisions closer to people, who could argue against that? Improve the connection between who spends the money, so how we tax people, and who spends the money. It's a good thing there, isn't it? These are all great things about devolution. Passing power, yeah? Breaking Westminster domination, hey, we need a bit of that. Wait, Westminster, I spent half my life there, not half my life, fifth of my life. It's far too much. Fed up with it. Been doing it for 12 years. Westminster's crap. We need policy that reflects local priorities. They're all good things about devolution. What can we talk about here, though? There's 4 points. The challenges of devolution, things to avoid or watch out about this devolution, pathways to devolution, and what do we need to do? Firstly, let's look at the challenge. We know right now the UK is the most centralised liberal democracy, one of the most centralised liberal democracies in the world. We know that London extracts wealth, talent from the rest of the country and dominates in terms of the cultural, social life of the country, in a sense. That's not new. It's been like that for centuries. Yeah, that's a fact. England's future, like it or not, is joined at the hip. That London thing, it's not something down there. It's intrinsic to our economic, social and cultural life. And like something that's joined at the hip, you rip that away, you'll hemorrhage. Yeah? So I'm pro-devolution. I'm pro-devolution. Yeah? I'm just talking about one of the challenges here. There's a deep embedded, for centuries we've been talking about this London thing. And even policy has been written 80 years ago. Barlow Commission explored all this. There's nothing new about devolution. But London is central to England's future. And for all the recent brouhaha, city deals, there's powers coming over. Nick Clegg talking about these northern futures. For all that, come on, get real. It's all small beer. Small beer in terms of real devolution. Yeah, we're talking it up because we've really heard it for a long time, this devolution. But it's small beer in real terms. Last week, the civil service had an update of the reform plans. Guess what word was not mentioned in their civil service, UK civil service reform plans? Devolution wasn't mentioned. There's an unreconstructed Westminster down there, yeah. So we need to up the ante, I think, in devolution. I'm Scottish, very interested in what was going on there in Scotland. What you had there was a very movement for significant change. That wasn't just Westminster and a few politicians saying it. It was actually something that was right down into the heart of the people, the spirit of the people. Yeah, it was something quite, not a technocratic thing. This was something that actually gripped us, Scots, and yeah, a movement was occurring. That was significant devolution, it seems, into what was being argued for. Things to avoid. It's a challenge then. The challenge is that we've got this London joined at the hip. Not much happening really anyway, despite what the politicians say. Things to avoid. Devolution's not necessarily virtuous in itself. You hear people talk about devolution as if it's like, oh, devolution is brilliant. Well, it might not be, right? I'm not against it, but there's certain strains of devolution we need to look out for. We need devolution that's more socially inclusive, that's what we believe in. It's more environmentally just, that actually brings politics back to the people. That's what real devolution is about. We are living, though, in an increasingly neoliberal world. Yeah? Open markets and deregulation, state that supports the private sector, remember the bank bailouts? Majority of economic and social policy works within that frame. It's dominant in the UK. Neoliberalism dominant in the UK and accepted wisdom. Now think about devolution within that paradigm, as we might get. It's about passing power. We can't make sure in passing power we just pass what is the UK neoliberalism, which looks after some but not the many, is passed over to be done in a local way. If you get hit by a central stick and you're on benefit sanctions, does it matter if you get hit by a local stick with benefit sanctions? It's still a bloody stick. So we need to make sure that the devolution we get is a people, socially just devolution. Some devolutionists are neoliberals. Ed, isn't he? Ed's a good guy. But some devolutionists are. Some devolutionists are neoliberals. They don't want the kind of world we want. If you're against central state, which through tax and spend redistributes wealth, if you're against the central state that taxes and distributes wealth, well, so are the neoliberals. If you believe in too much national redistribution, national laws and regulation and national standards, and that's what you're the kind of devolution, well, so are the neoliberals. If you look at things like fiscal autonomy and tax powers for the local areas, these are not just means by which you could improve the social fortunes of local residents, they're also how local capture of local wealth can be used for corporate interests. That's what the neoliberals think. Devolution, real devolution, about passing power down, but it's also about passing power to people. And we need to get away from some of the technocratic debates about devolution and think about some of those dangers that this neoliberal paradigm brings to devolution. It's not necessarily virtuous. Let's talk about pathways. Let's talk at the moment about Devo Mank. Hear that? Respublica. Devo Mank. Devo Mank, Devo Manchester. This is about kind of aggressive moving powers to cities. And I think Manchester should get more powers. But let's think about some of the pathways that might lead to. Let's say Manchester did get the aggressive powers that Respublica, Philip Launder, advocated. Let's say it gets all those great powers. Remember, at the moment, the UK is massively centralised and unequal. So Manchester gets more powers. What does London do? It says, I'll have more powers too. I'm going to have more tax and spend powers. I'm going to keep more wealth in London for Londoners. That's what they'll say. They've already started it, London Finance Commission, and it's ahead of Manchester. They're ahead of the game. They'll get there quicker than us. So they keep more wealth for themselves. At the moment, Manchester is a net beneficiary out of the public purse. It gets more than it puts back into the public purse. This city-state, this aggressive devolution, willy-nilly, quickly, will create... You think we've got inequality now? If that was to come to pass, then you'd have real inequality. Then you'd really see something. Because we'd have to fend for ourselves, and London would be fend for itself, but it's got all the advantages right now. So what do we need to do? Devolution was about a reformed nation-state. We need a bigger, deeper national debate like the one we had in Scotland. The debate at the moment is technocratic. It's not about the people. It's about transferring powers to central state, to the local state, in a technocratic way, politicians kind of way. It's not about us, and it needs to be about us. It's about the kind of lives we want, the kind of communities we want to live in. Form must follow function. What kind of country do we want? I'm a Mancunian. Doesn't sound like it, but I am. Right? My kids are Mancunian. What kind of country do I want my kids to live in? Right? Once I work that out, then I can think about what sort of devolution, how we want to organise our governance systems. In July, I called for a constitutional convention, which has since been kind of Labour are kind of saying it. I go further now. I don't think there's enough, because the constitutional convention is presently described by the Labour Party. It looks to be like sort of for Westminster people. We need a people's convention. All sectors, like we had in Scotland, all sectors get together, run by this sector perhaps, who's a conversation, the big conversation, what kind of country do we want to live in? Maybe we'll have a referendum with options at some point in England. Do we want that model, this one? We can get to that. What we don't need, and my worry is we're probably going to get it, we're going to get a technical, cooked up Westminster plan of what devolution we will get, which will just make it easier for some of the rotten things that happen in society to go on and continue. It's up to us, civil society, DCS, we need to get belligerent, we need to demand a devolution that's for us, we need to demand a devolution that breaks the mould and how politics work, we must demand a social inclusive England. Otherwise, we're going to get possibly a really horrible one through this devolution process. Thank you.
Great, well, thank you very much for inviting me. My name is Ed Cox, I'm Director of IPPR North, a technocratic think tank. And I'm going to be deliberately provocative now, so it'll make it far more fun. Neil and I are very, very, very much on the same page, and there's not a lot that I would disagree with, but I'm going to be deliberately, try and counterpose two different approaches, if you like. Well, not a different approach, but just to be a bit provocative. And we've only been a Northern think tank for 10 years, Neil, so I'm already losing compared to your 30 years. But again, the trustees of IPPR decided that we shouldn't have any more think tanks in the South. They couldn't get rid of themselves, but they at least planted IPPR North in the North, and I've done my best personally over the past 5 years to make sure that that Northernness really counts. And I think if I've done anything, then I've actually held my London colleagues to account on all of the policy work that they do, and that for me is perhaps the biggest challenge that I have, is to stop IPPR being a classic Westminster think tank. And I think if you read IPPR's general reports, you'll see that we have a greater influence over those national reports, if you like, than ever before, and that for me is hugely important. As well as the fantastic reports we write ourselves, and this is our most recent one, Decentralisation Decade, a plan for, a technocratic plan I should say, for economic prosperity, public service transformation and democratic renewal in the UK. And I've been writing stuff on devolution for probably about 15 years, and I do genuinely think that in the last few weeks, England's devolutionary moment feels like it is coming, or it even has come. When you see the Prime Minister come out onto Downing Street and saying there must be English devolution in tandem with Scottish devolution, I have to say even I was pretty shocked and spluttered into my cornflakes. I don't eat cornflakes, but spluttered into my breakfast when I heard him say that. And subsequently, we hear next week there's going to be a big announcement around devolution to cities, and we can debate that a little bit more, because I think Neil's made some important points about this so-called asymmetrical approach that we actually endorse at IPPR North. We think an asymmetrical approach, a multi-speed approach, is the right way to go about it, but perhaps not in the extreme terms that Philip Blond and Respublica are suggesting, neither, I think, in the way in which I understand next week announcements are going to be made. So a big moment has come, but I want to say that I want to sort of strike a note of pessimism around all of this. Not in the same way as Neil necessarily, but I think that we are now being caught politically between the devil and the deep blue sea. The Tories, I think, are wanting to play politics with this English devolutionary moment. All the debate, if you've been watching the news this week, has not been about devolution as I would understand devolution, passing power down. It's about English votes for English laws. Basically switching between, 63 million people and 57 million people. That's about the best that they seem to be able to talk to. And in fact, they're not even interested in English votes for English laws. They're interested in putting Labour in a very, very difficult place indeed. Equally, Labour is in a very, very daft position as well, in my personal opinion, in arguing for kicking the whole issue into the long grass with some kind of constitutional convention. And Neil, we can take issue with each other about whether that is the right approach. Yes, I think there needs to be a big national debate. Yes, it must be a people's debate, but this isn't something, I think we've got to grasp the moment that we've got right now, and that might require technocratic grasping of it, rather than allow, as I think the Labour Party wants to do, let the whole thing rumble on into the distance whilst they worry about how they keep Westminster in control of power and do their big kind of Fabian, big redistributive thing that they like to do. So I think you've got some problems, and I've been at the party conferences, and I think there's still many, many myths about devolution being peddled, particularly by MPs and Westminster politicians. And after all, let's remember, an MP, generally speaking, has tried to get away from local politics in order to become an MP. The last thing they want to do is then pass power back down again. It's only when they have the kind of maturity and wisdom of being ministers and they realise there is no power that they thought they had, that they then say, okay, possibly we'll pass a bit down. But in fact, most MPs are dead against devolution for the very fact that actually it goes completely against what they've spent most of their careers trying to get away from or trying to do. So, we wrote this report partly to take on some of these myths, but also to set out a detailed and technocratic plan. And I'm being very straightforward, but we genuinely have tried to do that. I think the argument around devolution is largely one, and Neil's rehearsed some of it already, so I'm not going to go into it in too much detail, but very simply, economically, we are just too centralised. We can see now, particularly our second-tier cities, is just not growing as fast as those overseas. In terms of public service reform, we just do not have the innovation in our system to allow public service reform to continue, and we know that top-down targets don't work, and we also know that not doing anything doesn't work, and cutting doesn't necessarily work either. So if we want to do something on public service reform, we've got to decentralise as well. And democratically, well, we all know what's going on at the moment, and particularly the fact that Westminster, people are getting more and more and more concerned about Westminster and the way in which... I mean, this term, Westminster leaders, where's that come from? That's a very recent term. But we now talk about the Westminster parties, the Westminster leaders, because it has become well known that that is the way they are orientated. I think now more than 50% of all Labour members are based in London. And that's a very, very telling statistic. So, we want to take on some myths. The first myth we want to take on is around postcode lotteries. A lot of people still say we can't have devolution because it will lead to postcode lotteries. In other words, services will be different from place to place. We think actually services being different from place to place could be quite a good thing, but what many people on the left think is that that might actually mean a race to the bottom. It might actually mean that some people have considerably worse services than others. All the international evidence now is showing the opposite, and there's lots of it in the report. I haven't got time to go into it in great detail, but there have been very, very carefully constructed indices of decentralisation, devolution, which have been set up and measured against things like subjective well-being, measured against things like income inequality. And we can now show that the more, in developed nations, it's not true for underdeveloped nations, but in developed nations, the more you devolve, the more equal a society you create, and that's fundamentally important. Secondly, there's this big myth that the public don't care. Yes, it is true. If you are a politician and you go and knock on somebody's door, they probably want to talk to you more about health or schools than they do necessarily about some kind of devolved institution. But if you poll people, as we have done, if you talk to people, as we've done through focus groups and so on, 82% of the population believe that the central-local balance is completely out of kilter and needs to be changed. Yes, there is confusion as to what institutional forms they then want instead. Mayors, regional assemblies, combined authorities, blah, blah, blah. People are not clear about what they want, but that's largely because they don't know necessarily exactly what these different forms might mean for them. If you say, would you like something like a London mayor, actually people say, oh yeah, we like that. We can see that, we quite like that idea. And so it's more a case of people not fully appreciating what these different forms might look like. Third myth is that councils aren't up to the job. Well, there's lots and lots of stats around which show you that councils are actually performing way better than central government on a whole range of different measures. But my argument on this is that this is a chicken and egg problem. Of course, if you strip capacity out of local authorities over decades, you will end up with an element of weaknesses. But the problem is that the capacity is in the wrong place. It's not that local authorities, by their very nature, lack capacity. It's the fact that we've put all our capacity in Westminster and not necessarily at the local level. My feeling is if we drive powers down, if we give local authorities, combined authorities more power, then you'll find that we already have some fantastic councillors, but we'll get even better councillors on the back of that. So, we tried to address some of these myths. We set out a series of safeguards in our report. I hated using the term. I was resentful about even typing it, but I typed it anyway because I felt that if the Westminster elite read this, they need to know what these safeguards are. Things like the democratic accountability of devolved institutions. Perhaps we can have a debate about how democratic Manchester or Greater Manchester is. Love to get into that territory. Secondly, processes of redistribution and equalisation. I think, yes, we can devolve tax powers. Yes, we can devolve benefits, but there've got to be systems of redistribution and equalisation in place as well to safeguard against the kind of aggressive devolution that Neil was talking about. And we need the right powers at the right level. And so in our report, we've set out what needs to go to what level. What we mustn't have, and I was really irritated that it was Eric Pickles that said this, is sucking powers up from communities into combined authorities when actually those powers need to continue to sit at the local authority or the neighbourhood level. So we've got to make sure that we have the right powers in the right places. So we, in our research, set out, one thing we found from talking to civil servants in particular was that one of the biggest obstacles to devolution is this sense that there is no big idea behind it. It's just individual ministers doing piecemeal things in different departments. And this is why we felt we needed to set out a technocratic plan. A plan that all civil servants could actually understand and get their heads around and say, yeah, I can see this is now all going in a particular direction. And the reason we chose that approach is that it has been very successful in France, historically one of the most centralised nations, in Japan and in Germany. A 10-year, 20-year plan actually is what's allowed central government to let go of powers in those places. So we've set out in here a 10-year programme, all timetabled, as technocratic as you could possibly get it, where we claim that there are certain things that you can do before the election, in the first 100 days after the election, at the first spending review, the first budget, and so on. We set out all of those things. Yes, there is room for a constitutional convention within our plan, but what we're saying is we don't try and do it all by the general election, as the Tories are suggesting. Neither do we wait for 10 years whilst we have this big constitutional convention. We do it as quickly, we do it in a very kind of measured timetable. And in the report we set out 40 different powers that we think should be handed down, and they're all very neatly colour-coded, telling you to which level they need to go to, from which department they need to come from, and the kind of timetable over which they need to be devolved. And they include powers over economic development matters, things like skills, things like the work programme, transport, innovation, energy. They also include powers over public services as well, local schools, custody budgets, probation services, devolved housing budgets. All of those things are in there, and we're saying how quickly and where they need to be devolved to. And crucially, our proposals involve some fiscal devolution as well. For a start, we think there should be 5-year funding settlements to local authorities and combined authorities. We think we should lift restrictions on council tax. We actually have virtually no fiscal freedom in this country at all, because even council tax is essentially controlled by bribes and by other freezes and incentives, if you like, for local authorities not to change council tax. And we argue for devolving business rates, property taxes, even an assignment of income tax, but all within a framework of equalisation, and all, crucially, being organised by some kind of independent body that, if you like, arbitrates between central and local government, rather than central government determining what needs to be done to local government. So we think that these are sort of crucially important measures that need to be taken, but we also think that there are some, and only a few, institutional changes that need to take place if we're going to see those powers passed down. We don't think it would be good for the country to start inventing new tiers and new rafts of bodies and organisations. I think we can do very well with what we've got already, but we do think we need a new wave of combined authorities. So not just the 5 that we've got already. We think other areas should bring forward their own plans, including what we call county combined authorities, where districts and county councils could actually work together, effectively form their own kind of combined authority. We think combined authorities, and here's a message to Manchester, need to set out clear plans for their partnership working, so we can see how local enterprise partnerships fit in, for example, with the way the combined authority is working, and how the kind of architecture of a place actually works. And we think that combined authorities in particular, and local authorities too, if they're going to get more powers, particularly tax-raising powers, they need to have greater democratic accountability than they have at the moment. Yes, there is one model which would be metro mayors, but we don't think that's the only model. We set out about 5 or 6 different models from different European cities that you could use in Manchester or in other places. Finally, we think that all of this does need to be underpinned by new legislation to strengthen the constitutional status of local government in itself, and for that matter other subnational partners. Just as we've had the Scotland and Wales Acts, we think we need an England Act of some kind which once and for all enshrines the constitutional autonomy of English local government. And yes, let's have a big debate about that, and let's do that over the next 5 years. Let's do it over the next 5 years or so. But to finish, the big question for me is not so much what do politicians do with this devolutionary moment. I think that the evidence there is there. We've deliberately set out a technocratic plan to show them how they could do it in a joined up way. And we know that other countries are doing it perfectly reasonably, so don't take any nonsense about, oh, it's impossible to do it because of this reason or that reason. Most modern democracies devolve to a much greater degree than we do. Now, for me, the big question is what the English people do next. And I think this chimes with some of the things that Neil was saying. Will this devolutionary moment coalesce, perhaps around regional campaigns? We're seeing a kind of growth in regional independence movements in places like Cornwall and Yorkshire. Perhaps it might coalesce around some kind of pan-northern body. This is my personal dream, that we might have some kind of, ultimately, council for the north that can compete with people like Boris Johnson and people like Alex Salmond and have a voice for the whole of the north of England in some way. Or perhaps it will coalesce around UKIP. There's another thought. Or will we just fragment? Cities competing for their different parts of the pie, lone voices, each with their own campaigns on whether it's, I don't know, equalities or transport or whatever it happens to be, and Westminster clinging on to power for another 5 years or so in some kind of dysfunctional minority government. I'm at the moment desperately trying to capture the zeitgeist. What do people really think is going to happen over the next few months? As we build up to a general election. Are the English people going to seize their devolutionary moment, or are we all going to go back into our organisations and miss the opportunity that I think is there before us? Thank you.
Just have a question, which was whether you think there's a place that electoral reform actually has to play in this, because it seems to me that we are so polarised between two, not very desirable options, and not really much we can do about it, because we've got first past the post in almost every authority and central government as well.
I think we do need electoral reform, but more importantly we need Westminster reform. Like Ed, work in different administrations, so work in Wales, Northern Ireland, Scotland. Westminster's a busted flush, it needs to be pushed over the edge, and it needs significant reform. And I think that the debate is interesting in the sense that that's really the key blocker here. And there's no devolution moment, I'd have to disagree with. There's no devolution moment. There's been a devolution century, yeah? But it's nothing's happened. And nothing's going to happen again. And Ed's brilliant report is great, but without Westminster reform, it'll be piecemeal. Nothing really significant will happen. That's the big blocker. Yeah? They've only got interested really seriously because it was going to break up in the UK. So we need electoral reform, but more importantly, Westminster reform.
Yeah, I agree we need electoral reform, and I think it's likely to come, actually. I think we're going to end up with a minority government next May. I think we're going to spend 5 years but unable to pass any legislation with all kinds of concoctions of groupings of MPs and so on. And I think everybody's going to say, do you know what, we could do with doing this properly, let's have proportional representation and just do this properly and have proper coalitions in the way in which most modern democracies do. So I think it will come in that way. But one thing that we've consistently argued for in our paper is even if they don't want electoral reform at a national level, allow local authorities to get going with it. You know, why can't we use proportional representation now in local authority elections and other elections? So why can't we have 16-year-olds voting in Manchester? You know, we ought to just unleash, if you like, electoral reform at the local level and then let Westminster catch up later on.
I suppose I have enormous concerns about the idea of devolution, and they centre around our present financial position and the level of inequity between North and South. And I think the prime consideration from the Tory government in particular is about the assignment of responsibility for cuts. And so that if they can devolve power, devolve responsibility to the local area, then they devolve the political responsibility for the continuing and massive cuts that are going to happen in our economy, and the continuing, probably, financial, economic decrease in the north, which is not going to turn around in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I share that concern, but I don't think it is beyond our capability to design a system of redistribution, a system of equalisation that can mitigate that to a degree. I personally think that the North does have to take a hit over the next 10, 15 years. We do have to lose out to London, but we've been losing out to London consistently, for decades. So I think actually rather have the power and take a bit of a hit, but then enable us to get on our own feet and drive our own economy, drive our own public service reform, than carry on with the status quo. So I share the concern, but I think we can deal with it to a degree.
I would kind of disagree with that in a sense. I think what you've touched upon is a very, very important one, is that we're seeing devolution at this point in time dancing on the head of a neoliberal pen, if you like. Yeah? And what you indicate is probably would come to pass. We need a priori redistribution before any proper decentralisation or devolution can take place. And until there is that proper redistribution and a reform of the English state, an English economic state, including settlement and all that, well, all we'll do is create deeper and ingrain the divisions that divide us in this country.
Can we debate this a little bit? Because I disagree in the sense that I think we can wait, and England will get more and more neoliberal, and we just keep waiting. I think the best hope for me of a progressive future is to, even in a neoliberal paradigm, give those powers to Greater Manchester. Greater Manchester says, you know what, we're going to be a socially democratic city, we're going to do it differently. But we have to take those powers, we have to be able to raise our taxes, we have to be able to determine our own benefit system, we have to be able to say we want to be a living wage city. Do you see what I mean? No, aside from the central state, because if we wait for the central state to be like that, we'll never get it.
I agree, we're not disagreeing, I don't think, in that sense, because I think you're right. We do need those repatriation of powers to Manchester and all that thing comes with it. But at the same time, Manchester needs to be arguing for a reform of the central state at the same time. We need to work hand in glove, and I'm worried that one will get ahead of the other and we'll get deeper divides. So I think it can trigger something. But as soon as it triggers that, we do need to say, right, let's go on to the central economic state and start reforming that, because otherwise we'll just create more problems. So I'm a centralist. I believe centralism and localism together. Yeah, and that's how I'm against asymmetry, because I think they need to work hand in glove. Otherwise, you end up in more asymmetry and more inequality.
And I think you've got a point, and just to be controversial, because I think at the moment the way Manchester's playing the game is incredibly dangerous, because I think it is absolutely biting the hand off the government for every little bit of power that it can possibly get in a pretty neoliberal way itself, and isn't necessarily showing that it wants a kind of more social democratic future. And I think that I am concerned about that, particularly if we've got a big announcement coming next week. I think we've got to, as residents of Manchester, we've got to challenge that and say, okay, so you're getting more powers, but we actually want a more social democratic Manchester, please.
Surely, and I think the important point here is London. London's ahead of the game. Look, Boris wants tax and spend powers, and they'll get it quicker than Manchester. And if they do, as I said from the floor, That would be a nightmare. And also, you look at some history as well. You've got Malaysia, you go to Singapore, city-state, brilliant, really successful, covered on gas, like a London. Go to Penang. Go to Penang. It's like Manchester, well, kind of Manchester, more industrial, impoverished. Yeah, not that, you know, it's bad. You've got a city-state that's now independent, and the broader Malaysia that's impoverished. And that could come to pass, folks, if we have a too deep, asymmetrical, aggressive devolution, I think.
Just to pick up the asymmetrical theme, if Boris moves from mayorship to back to Parliament, will that have any benefit? Will that change of colour within the London setup have any benefit to us in the north?
I lived in London for 5 years, and one of the important things about London is there's many great Londoners, brilliant London people, who believe that London is an intrinsic part of England and has a duty to play its role in England. And I believe that we could get a change, and if we could, yeah, it's not certainly getting a political point, which would actually embrace a sense that London is not just looking after itself, but London is an intrinsic part of England and the UK. And that needs to be restated more about London. And I think there's too many people that's talking up London as London, you know, we need to get more for London. There needs to be a respect of the many people in London that believe they are English, they are part of the UK, and we, as a city, need to play a dutiful role as part of the wider United Kingdom.
My comment on that would be that I think Boris has played his hand very well as a leader. Don't misunderstand me. I think he's done very well. It's hard, to be honest, not to do well as London mayor. If you think that you've got whatever it is, £5,500 per person to spend on public transport, compared to in Manchester £1,800, in North East £300 per person over the next 20 years. You've got a big pot to play with. You've got a lot of incredibly talented individuals. When you talk about capacity, vast amounts of capacity. So you really, really have to screw it up to be a bad London mayor, I think it's fair to say. The question for me, though, is how do we find our voice in the north of England? Now, Bernstein and Lees have got a formula, and it's working okay for us, and I think next week we'll be even happier in some respects about the way in which that formula is working. But to be honest, if you live in Lancashire, or you live in, or you live in Northumberland or somewhere like that, then frankly, the Bernstein-Leeson model doesn't really work for you particularly well at all. And I'm concerned because I do think in Manchester we can be, and I speak for myself, a bit myopic on this, and we kind of do a London thing and say, well, we're all right, thanks very much, so we crack on. And I actually think this is where I think there is an argument for much greater pan-northern collaboration than we have at the moment. We're getting some of it, people like Jim O'Neill talking about Manpool and HS3 and getting that kind of conglomeration, whatever you want to call it, of cities working together. And I think there's something in that economically as well as politically. But how do we find our voice in that situation to compete with the Mayor of London, whoever the Mayor of London is likely to be? And I think that's one of the real questions of our time, and I think it's one of the questions that we as the people of the north of England need to put our minds to say, how are we going to articulate the voices, because it isn't one voice, the voices of the north in a more effective way. And I've been struggling with this issue for 3 or 4 years, and I still don't understand where the answer is going to come from. And I just hope that there is a political moment at some point. And I don't mind if it's Richard Lees. I genuinely don't mind who it might be, but I just think that it is not good enough for the cities to essentially compete with one another on what is a very, very challenging agenda. Can I say one word about asymmetrical? We use the word asymmetrical all the time, but I want to just sort of caveat it a little bit and talk about multi-speed. Asymmetrical does not mean what I think is going to be announced next week, which is the big cities getting loads and everybody else getting nothing. That's not multi-speed. That's just giving a few people a few things. I think that devolution should happen across the board, different powers to different levels at different speeds. That's what I mean by asymmetrical, and not just lots of powers to big cities.
There's just an important, I think, polemic point, but it is an important one about democracy, what it's all about. We know from history, in terms of political thought, is that corporate power, don't like democracy as such because it gets in the way. Corporate power doesn't really like people standing in front of trees that's going to stop them knocking them down, yeah? Because they get in the way, yeah? Now, we need to ensure, it seems in this whole devolution debate, that we don't make it easier for those who don't really, who want their own power, corporate power, vested interest establishment. We've got to be very wary of that. And the conversation should not be about Boris or elected mayors here or all that stuff. It really has to be, and it maybe sounds glib, it has to be about the people. We need to stand in front of those things and say, this is what we want in terms of our governance. It's not up for them, it's up for us. It's not up for me or Nick, Ed writing great papers. It's not up to us. It's got to be about all of us having a deeper conversation about this. Now, I don't want to hold them up. There might be a devolution moment, but I don't want to have a devolution moment that ends up like a pig's ear, right? It's the moment here is for us to actually discuss and have a bigger debate of what kind of country we want to live in, because it's falling around our ears. And that has to be what we grab onto, not some of the sort of Westminster cooked or think tank solutions. This is new to me. I'm a policy geek. I'm like Ed, I'm into technocratic solutions. I'm into it. I've just seen what's happened in Scotland. I'm getting despairing about where we're going as a society. And actually, I now know it's not about me having clever thoughts. It's about mobilising people to stand in front of them trees so they don't get knocked down.
I hope that's fueled a bit of passion and a bit of thought to take away from here, and I'd really love it if you could engage with us. So maybe through our website, through kind of our social media contact, we can hear from you after today. We can encourage people to talk to us about some of those key issues and what you want us to do, because I think you need to be telling us what we collectively throughout the North West can be doing to do those two things, which is to articulate our voice and to have a real devolution conversation. So thanks very much. Can we thank our speakers today?